I will never forget that day in the Tasman Sea. The wind and furious waves battered the NZS Wellington as we relentlessly continued our search for the Deep Origin expedition. It had been a month since their disappearance, and hope was fading by the hour. As a search and rescue officer, I had taken part in dozens of missions, but something about this particular operation unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. That morning, the radar picked up a weak signal about 50 nautical miles off the coast. It was different from the false alarms we had been receiving over the past few weeks. Captain Johnson, an experienced rescue operator, immediately changed our course. The sea was especially rough, with 5-meter waves making our large vessel feel like a drifting nutshell. Then, we spotted the first visual sign. A red flare cut through the gray sky. My heart raced. Years of experience told me we were about to find survivors. But nothing could have prepared me for what we witnessed. Through my binoculars, I made out a small lifeboat being violently tossed by the waves. There was movement aboard. The approach was extremely delicate. The wind howled at 45 knots, making any maneuver difficult. Our rescue team quickly got ready, putting on diving suits and checking first aid equipment. The helicopter was not an option due to the harsh weather conditions, so we had to carry out a traditional sea rescue. When we finally got close enough, it was clear the survivors were in critical condition. There were 5 people huddled in a lifeboat designed for 8. Their faces showed a terror that went far beyond the natural fear of shipwreck survivors. There was something else, something I would only understand after hearing their accounts. The first person we rescued was a tall man who could barely stand. His skin had an unhealthy pallor, and his eyes held a vacant, haunted look. Next, we pulled up a woman who was trembling uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from a visible terror that seemed to consume her entirely. The other 3 were in similar conditions: dehydrated, exhausted, and visibly disturbed. The rescue operation lasted nearly 2 hours. The rough sea conditions made every movement a challenge, and we had to be extra careful with the survivors, who barely had the strength to assist in the process. Our medical team began administering first aid right on deck, providing thermal blankets, hydration, and checking vital signs. The most striking thing was the silence. Usually, shipwreck survivors express relief when rescued. They cry, they give thanks. But this group remained disturbingly mute, as if still trapped in a deep state of shock. They only whispered fragmented words and clung to each other, seeking mutual comfort. In the ship's infirmary, we began to grasp the extent of their trauma. The 5 were members of the Deep Origin expedition. 3 oceanographers, a professional diver, and a marine archaeologist. Their clothes were in tatters, and their bodies bore wounds and marks that didn't match those of a simple shipwreck. Some had deep gashes, as if they had been attacked by something with claws or sharp instruments. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the ship, a heavy silence took hold. The survivors were placed in bunks in the infirmary, receiving IV fluids and medication. The ship's doctor noted that beyond their physical injuries, they all exhibited severe signs of post-traumatic stress. Any loud noise startled them, and the sound of waves crashing against the hull seemed to cause them particular distress. As I coordinated the initial record of their statements, I noticed that they avoided looking at the portholes, as if afraid of seeing something outside. The marine archaeologist, who seemed the least shaken of the group, managed to tell us their names and roles. But when we pressed for more details about what had happened, she simply closed her eyes and began to tremble. Captain Johnson, with over 30 years of experience at sea, privately told me he had never seen survivors in such a state of distress. Something extraordinary had happened to these people during the month they had been missing. The mystery of what really transpired with the Deep Origin expedition was only beginning to unfold, and as night fell over the Tasman Sea, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were merely scratching the surface of something far greater and far more disturbing. During the first hours after the rescue, I began organizing information on each of the survivors. It was my responsibility to document everything meticulously, and as I spoke with the medical team, details about each of them began to emerge, revealing individual stories intertwined in the same nightmare. Dr. Marcus Bennett, a physical oceanographer and leader of the expedition, was a 52-year-old man with a distinguished career in deep ocean current studies. On his wrist, we found a digital watch still functioning, apparently the only electronic device that survived. His hands, once steady in handling delicate equipment, now trembled uncontrollably. The doctors noted multiple lacerations on his arms and back, some still in the process of healing. Dr. Sarah O'Connor, a 38-year-old chemical oceanographer specializing in deep water composition, kept her gaze fixed on the infirmary ceiling. Her impressive academic background contrasted sharply with her current state. She could barely form complete sentences. She had chemical burns on her hands and forearms, suggesting contact with an unknown substance. In moments of lucidity, she murmured about lights in the depths and eyes that glow in the dark. The third oceanographer, Dr. James Torres, a 45-year-old marine biologist, was in the most severe condition. Specializing in abyssal ecosystems, he had built a strong reputation through his research on creatures from deep-sea trenches. On his neck, we found a series of circular marks resembling suction cups, except they were far larger than anything known. He drifted between periods of consciousness and delirium, during which he repeated words in a language no one recognized. Mike Harrison, a 33-year-old professional diver, was the youngest in the group. With over 3,000 hours of diving experience, he was considered one of the best in his field. His legs bore deep cuts, as if he had been dragged by something with immense strength. The most disturbing aspect was his behavior. He refused to bathe or even touch water, a man who had spent his professional life submerged. Dr. Ana Waikato, a 42-year-old marine archaeologist of mixed Maori descent, seemed to be the only one managing to maintain some composure. A specialist in ancient Pacific civilizations, she had taken part in several significant expeditions. The notes in a waterlogged notebook she carried were mostly illegible, but a few pages contained detailed drawings of underwater structures and symbols that bore no resemblance to any known writing system. As the night wore on, I observed how they interacted with each other. Despite their evident trauma, they maintained a closeness that could only be forged through extreme shared experiences. They moved in sync whenever a loud noise sounded, as if they had developed their own alert system. They communicated through glances and subtle gestures, demonstrating a mutual understanding that transcended words. The initial medical reports indicated that all of them showed signs of prolonged exposure to deep sea pressure, even with protective equipment. Their eardrums displayed damage consistent with abrupt pressure changes, and blood tests revealed chemical alterations that the doctors couldn't explain. The medical team was particularly intrigued by a pattern of phosphorescent markings that each of them had on different parts of their bodies. Under ultraviolet light, these marks emitted a bluish luminescence that gradually faded over the hours. Samples were collected for further analysis, but at that moment, no one could determine their origin. During the early hours of the morning, while making my rounds, I noticed that they had unconsciously arranged themselves in a circular formation in their bunks, as if they were still on the lifeboat. Dr. Waikato occasionally whispered words in Maori, to which the others responded with nods of understanding, even though they didn't know the language. It was as if they not only shared memories of their trauma, but had also developed a new form of understanding, born from the depths. The most striking thing was how their complementary expertise seemed to have been crucial to their survival. Each of them possessed specific knowledge that, together, formed a larger puzzle. The diver, with his practical experience, the oceanographers, with their scientific expertise, and the archaeologist, with her understanding of ancient oceanic legends and histories, all had contributed in some way to keeping them alive during that terrible month. It was on the second night after the rescue that we obtained the first coherent account. Dr. Waikato, still trembling, began narrating the events that led to the expedition's disappearance. The other survivors, seated on their infirmary beds, supplemented her story with nods and occasional whispers, as if each word evoked memories too painful to ignore. The expedition had begun normally, she explained. The research vessel was well equipped, and the first 2 weeks were dedicated to collecting geological data from the seafloor. It was during a routine operation with the ROV, the remotely operated vehicle, that things started to change. The equipment detected signs of inexplicable thermal activity, at a depth of about 2,000 meters. Dr. Bennett interrupted at this point, his hoarse voice breaking the silence. They had been watching us from the beginning. According to him, the ship's instruments began displaying subtle anomalies, interference in communications, inexplicable variations in sonar readings, minor deviations in navigation systems. At the time, they attributed it to adverse weather conditions. Mike Harrison, the diver, finally broke his silence to describe the first direct encounter. During a routine dive at 100 meters deep, he noticed movements in the water that defied normal ocean current patterns. It was like the water had a will of its own, he said, gripping his blanket tightly. Then I saw them, humanoid forms, but unlike anything I've ever encountered in the oceans. Dr. O'Connor, still avoiding eye contact, described the creatures with scientific precision despite the terror in her voice. They were approximately 2 meters tall, with bluish-gray skin covered in bioluminescent patterns, webbing between their fingers, and gill slits on their necks. Their eyes were large, adapted to the darkness of the depths, and reflected light in a way similar to some abyssal fish. The attack on the ship began the following night. Dr. Torres, speaking for the first time since the rescue, described how the creatures displayed a surprising level of tactical intelligence. They first disabled the communication systems, then the engines. The ship was left adrift, completely isolated. They had technology, he emphasized, tools and equipment that seemed to grow out of the water itself. The crew of 25 tried to resist, but they were clearly at a disadvantage. The creatures could move through the water with inhuman speed and agility, emerging from the waves to attack and then vanishing back into the depths. They wielded weapons that seemed to produce underwater shockwaves, capable of stunning or instantly killing their targets. They weren't just attacking us, Dr. Waikato explained. The survivors described how the creatures separated the crew into groups, as if conducting some kind of macabre experiment. Some were taken into the depths, never to be seen again. Others were hunted down until they were utterly exhausted. For 3 weeks, the 5 survivors were forced into a deadly game of hide-and-seek through the flooded corridors of the slowly sinking ship. They developed techniques to move silently in the water, learned to predict the creatures' movement patterns, and used their combined scientific knowledge to improvise defenses. Mike described how the creatures seemed particularly interested in his diving skills, often watching him closely, but never attacking directly. Dr. O'Connor discovered that certain chemical compounds from the ship's lab appeared to repel them temporarily, granting the group brief but crucial moments of respite. The opportunity to escape came when a strong storm approached. The creatures seemed to retreat in response to the atmospheric pressure changes, giving the group a chance to reach the lifeboat. But even as we escaped, Dr. Waikato concluded, we were certain they were letting us go, as if we had passed some kind of test. As they finished their account, I noticed they kept glancing toward the infirmary's portholes. The dark water outside now seemed to carry a far more sinister meaning. The sound of the waves crashing against the ship's hull, once so familiar, now held a new kind of threat. 5 survivors, 5 stories intertwined in a submarine nightmare that defied our understanding of what truly dwells in the depths of our oceans. After 2 days at sea during the return journey, Captain Johnson made a controversial decision: to return to the site of the shipwreck. The survivors visibly grew uneasy at the news but understood the need to document and investigate what had happened. As the security officer, I coordinated the operation with our dive team, maintaining a safe distance from the exact point where the survivors had been found. The site was marked by a significant magnetic anomaly that interfered with our instruments. Sonar revealed an irregular underwater topography, different from the oceanic maps of the region. Our first discovery was the wreckage of the expedition's ship, scattered across approximately 2 kilometers at a depth of 300 meters. Using our most advanced ROV, we began mapping the area. That was when we came across something that made the ROV operator question whether the cameras were functioning correctly. Amidst the modern wreckage, perfectly geometric structures emerged from the ocean floor. At first, they appeared to be natural rock formations, but as the ROV approached, their artificial origin became undeniable. Dr. Bennett, still weakened but professionally curious, identified architectural patterns in the structures that defied our understanding of underwater engineering. Perfectly carved arches supported structures that seemed to defy gravity, even under the immense pressure of the water. The surfaces displayed a material of unknown composition, exhibiting both metallic and organic properties. Dr. Waikato, observing the ROV footage, began taking frantic notes. The structures followed a pattern she recognized from her studies of ancient Pacific architecture, but on a scale and complexity never before documented. Some walls bore symbols similar to those found in her waterlogged notebook, now partially legible. As the ROV advanced, we discovered that the ruins extended far beyond what we had initially imagined. Tunnels and passages branched out in all directions, suggesting a submerged city of considerable proportions. In certain areas, we detected unexplained thermal emissions and water currents that seemed to circulate unnaturally. The most unsettling discovery came when the ROV illuminated what appeared to be a central chamber. The walls were covered in relief carvings depicting figures similar to those described by the survivors, but in scenes suggesting a highly advanced civilization. Some images showed what seemed to be interactions with primitive humans, confirming Dr. Waikato's suspicions about connections to Maori legends. Mike Harrison, momentarily overcoming his trauma, identified technology within the ruins that appeared to be functional, even after an indeterminable period submerged. We observed structures emitting a faint bluish luminescence, similar to the markings found on the survivors' bodies, which were now beginning to fade. Dr. Torres, analyzing the temperature readings and the chemical composition of the water surrounding the ruins, detected patterns suggesting an active circulation system. The water currents seemed to follow specific pathways, like a giant circulatory system. During the investigation, our equipment began experiencing the same failures reported by the original expedition: interference in communications, sonar fluctuations, and small but consistent deviations in navigation instruments. Recognizing the signs of danger, Captain Johnson ordered the immediate retrieval of the ROV. In the final moments before we pulled the equipment back, the cameras captured movement in the shadows of the ruins, indistinct forms moving with studied precision, always at the periphery of the light's reach. Dr. O'Connor, watching the footage, identified bioluminescent patterns similar to those of the creatures that had attacked them. Our retreat was ordered, yet hurried. As the ship pulled away, the instruments continued recording anomalies. The most unsettling of all were the sound patterns captured by the hydrophones. Rhythmic sequences unlike any known marine life, but carrying a complexity that suggested intelligent communication. The data collected during that brief investigation would fill volumes of scientific reports, but the implications of what we had discovered went far beyond conventional science. We had found evidence of a civilization that not only existed parallel to our own, but had possibly been observing us for millennia from the depths of the ocean. In the days that followed the discovery of the ruins, Dr. Waikato spent hours in intense discussions with Dr. Bennett, correlating the symbols found in the underwater structures with ancient Maori narratives. The stories about Taniwa, which she had always considered folkloric allegories, were beginning to take on a disturbingly real dimension. Her ancestors spoke of these beings as guardians of the seas, powerful creatures that could take multiple forms and would either protect or punish humans according to their own criteria. During one particularly restless night, while we were still navigating back to the port, the archaeologist showed me old wooden tablets she kept in her office aboard, preserved from previous expeditions. The worn engravings depicted figures that bore undeniable similarities to the creatures found by the expedition. The Maori described them as Kaitiaki o Te Moana, the guardians of the ocean. Dr. Torres, analyzing water samples collected near the ruins, discovered inexplicable chemical compounds that seemed to alter their basic properties. The water displayed impossible characteristics, such as maintaining its surface tension even under extreme pressures. In some samples, unknown microorganisms emitted the same bioluminescence observed in the creatures. One night, while comparing reports in my cabin, I heard a peculiar sound coming from the ship's hydrophones. Dr. O'Connor, who spent sleepless nights monitoring the underwater frequencies, identified sound patterns that resembled the symbols found in the ruins. Mike Harrison, on his last day aboard before being transferred to specialized treatment on land, confided in me something that still haunts me. During his final dive before the attack, he swore he saw, deep below, lights moving in strange formations, like a submerged city. Months have passed since those events in the Tasman Sea. The survivors have gone their separate ways, each carrying their visible and invisible scars. The The samples collected were distributed among various laboratories, but conclusive results were never released. The photographs of the ruins, although clear during our investigation, turned out inexplicably blurry or corrupted. Occasionally, I receive reports from other vessels about anomalies similar to those we encountered. Unexplained lights in the depths, equipment failures, strange sounds picked up by hydrophones. Each report adds a new piece to a puzzle that seems to have no solution. On nights like this, as I write my final report on the events, I wonder, will we ever be ready for the truth that lies hidden in the depths? Or perhaps the real question is, will they judge us worthy of knowing it? The mystery of the creatures of the Tasman Sea remains unsolved, echoing in the depths of our oceans as a reminder that, despite all our technology and knowledge, we are still mere visitors in a world we have barely begun to understand.